the last, but definitely not the least, of the sessions in our event today. We go to a question that, in a way, has been teed up a little bit by some of the discussions we've already had in the conference today. We've touched on this at various points, I think. The major question we're looking at is about political disenchantment and left behind or forgotten about places, and thinking about the policy dilemmas and potential kinds of intervention that might be tried in relation to them. Obviously, there is a pretty familiar political context to this. We're all pretty used to the sort of debate that has become very established about whether there are certain kinds of whether geographical inequalities and the disparity between wealthier regions, poorer regions, better performing cities, worse performing cities, urban areas, coastal towns, whether those divisions are driving a sense in some places of greater political disenchantment and perhaps support for anti-system parties or populist parties. That's one aspect of this. But there's a much wider debate also, which we'll touch on as we look outside the UK as well, about whether this is now becoming really quite an ingrained pattern across many different countries. And of course, alongside that, there is a history here, and the history is of many different attempts to do, usually under the heading of regional policy making, but to try to tackle exactly these kinds of disparities, which are, as I'm sure we will discover, not exactly new in many respects. That's the sort of landscape both for this panel discussion, but also these are some of the issues that we've tried to look at here in the Bennett Institute through the PLACE programme of research and engagement, which I lead. If you want to know more about that, please do look at our website. So, to discuss these issues, we have, I think, a really good diverse panel. I'll go along the row here. Sitting immediately to my left is Andres Rodriguez Puz, who is the Professor of Economic Geography at LSE and is really one of the leading people in the world writing on exactly these questions through a sort of comparative lens, also advising on policy, and we'll hear more about that. Sitting two away from me, Jess Studdert is the Chief Executive of the independent think tank New Local, and is a leading contributor to debates on the questions about devolution, localism, local government here in the UK. And then sitting further along, we have Tom Walker, and I'm just going to get your biography out, Tom, because it's a couple of things I want to just point out in it. It sounds ominous, I know, but I don't mean it badly. Tom is Executive Director of the Economy, Investment and Public Health. That's the bit I wanted to look up, just to remember your title, at Essex County Council. But as some of you may know, Tom actually has there's a history before that of working in central government, working in Whitehall. He was the lead for the Levelling Up task force, so a few governments ago. Was very involved in producing the Levelling Up white paper. But I think before that as well, you've been in a number of roles in different parts of Whitehall, very much focused on these kind of, exactly these questions. So I mean this in the best possible way. You are a veteran of these debates and has an insider view of this. So that's the panel. Let me start with a question. I'll start with, I'm going to give the same question to all three, because it's a very broad question, and then we'll dig into some of the answers. Let's start with diagnosis. So looking at these sort of trends that we're talking about in terms of the disparities between regions and the sort of left behind places that are emerging within different kinds of region, it should be said. We're not just looking at differences between regions, but also, as we know here locally, there are disparities even within higher income regions. But looking at the explanations for some of these patterns, where should we look? Should we be thinking about some of the things we touched on earlier, changes in the nature of the modern economy? Should we be looking more at our systems of government and politics and decision making? Or should we be looking more carefully at the specific characteristics and histories of some of these particular places. So, Andres, why don't you go first?
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. But before I go into the causes, where should we be looking? I would like to just give a few figures about the magnitude of the problem, and also about the consequences, because the causes are important, but the consequences are even more important. And we are in a crisis, you probably have realized. The world seems to be collapsing as we are talking. I mean, I just came from Brussels. I go to Brussels virtually every week. And every time I go there, there's a new crisis that's emerging. And that's because people are revolting, possibly not in a nice way, in a bad way. And whether it is the Gilets jaunes in France, or the Yellow Vests, or the Dutch farmers, or Chilean students burning the underground system in Santiago, what we're seeing is a revolt that is happening in many areas. One is the ballot box. We had Trump 2, we had Brexit, but for example, in the European Union, there has been a massive growth of Euroscepticism. Today, we have 1/3 of the votes cast in national elections going to Eurosceptic parties. And in the whole of Europe, right now, is 25% of the vote going to extreme right-wing, let's say, liberal or anti-system parties, which, if we put it in perspective, in the 1930s, we ended up with just 22% maximum support for these parties. And this turn has consequences, because many of these parties, at the extremes, the liberal parties, anti-system, might have a diagnosis that appeals to voters, that might be in some parts right, but their solutions are hardly ever right. We just have to go to examples. Argentina is the original populist country. When it started in the 1930s, it was among the richest in the world, certainly in the top 5. And now, after 90 years of populism, we all know where it is. Thailand was the country which was the poster child of the IMF in Southeast Asia, but it was the country also with the highest level of disparities of any of the countries I work with in the world. And those disparities led to the arrival of populism, stalemate between the elites and the populism, several coups, and since then, Thailand has been the worst performing country in the whole of Southeast Asia. And across, I don't have to mention what the consequences of Brexit are, because Project Fear has turned Project Reality. So the question is, why has this happened? And there are several types of explanations. If you go to political scientists, that's mainly all about cultural wars. It's all about people like me. Old, white, balding. I was going to say not educated. I'm a university professor. That doesn't apply. But all the rest. And white. That are unhappy with a world in which we don't no longer fit in a world in which we are strangers in our own place. I mean, I love living in London, but I know that quite a lot of people would like to go back to the UK that they witnessed in the 1950s. Not that it was any better than what we had before. I would say it was much worse, but that's where they want to go. And this is being reproduced across the world. The world has changed, and people want to get out of the world that is moving, or this type of world, at fast pace. The second is more of a geographical sort of explanation, but mainly coming also from political scientists, which is about geography, is cities versus suburbs, intermediate cities and rural areas. That you are in the center of Philadelphia, and there, or the inner suburbs of Philadelphia, the richest people in the US, of the western suburbs of Philadelphia, are voting together for the same candidates with the poorest people in the US, which are people living in the ghettos of northern Philadelphia. Whereas if you move 15 miles out, it's Trump country throughout the rest of Pennsylvania until you get to Pittsburgh. And the third explanation is all about stagnation, economic decline, which is the one I'm trying to promote. It's fundamentally, and they're not mutually exclusive. It's about places that have been neglected and have been stagnating. I got figures for the European Union. Today, in the European Union, there are, and this is not including, unfortunately, the UK, there are 60 million people that live in places where GDP per head, in real terms, is lower than what it was in the year 2000. There are 135 million that live in places that have barely grown, less than 0.5% growth per year per capita, which means that 1/3 of the population of the European Union is in places that have been stagnating. And these people are no longer just standing still and saying, well, we're losing out. They are revolting and saying, well, we're not the only ones. If you have no future, we have no future, we're going to show you in London or in Paris what it is to have no future. Because one of the main problems that we have had is that these places have been neglected by policy. In Europe, we have had two types of policies. A European policy for cohesion that has mainly targeted the less developed places, the places that are at levels of development below 75% of the average of the European Union. And then we have had a lot of national, spatially blind, let's say horizontal policies that in principle should affect the whole of the country together. But when you start looking at the data, most of the policies that have been implemented by different governments, whether Conservative or Labour in the UK, or different governments in France or in Spain or in Germany, they are policies for the more developed and dynamic areas of the country. So where does that leave places like Leeds or Bradford or Newcastle or Strasbourg, or let's say if I'm going to Germany, let's say parts of northern Germany or the Ruhr, that leaves them saying no one cares about us, so let's try something different.
Thank you very much. That's a very salutary analysis there. We'll come back to some of those points. Jess.
Thank you. Just to introduce myself as from New Local, we are a think tank and a network of local authorities. So a lot of what I'm going to say is based on what we're seeing in local government and the response to some of the challenges there. I think it's been said before, and it bears saying again. The English context, which I'll speak to mostly, is we're a highly centralised country on the one hand, a strong top-down model of Whitehall-led initiative and policy making, and on the other hand we have stark regional inequalities, and the two have gone hand in hand for decades in terms of our public policy model. And that's a really dominant frame for how we then approach problems like left behind areas or overlooked areas. And I think that it's possible to look at trends in public policy over recent decades to respond to it, whether it was neighbourhood renewal funding in the 2000s, regional development agencies that got disbanded when there was a change in government in 2010, and then more recently devolution policy, and levelling up. All of these are short-term initiatives often that come from the centre and come from the initiative of different government departments, rather than thinking actually it's about how we could bottom up really respond to places and create a different power dynamic. And so I think one of the challenges is one of the offshoots of our centralised model is quite a highly dominant Whitehall model of public services, which I think the UK and England is quite unique in. And I think our first past the post electoral system allows that to be hidden until we do something like give people a yes/no referendum. So we're allowed that's largely a sense of apathy, but then has been turning in the last decade since 2016 into increasing anger and discontent and sort of palpable alienation. And so we have had responses nationally, and national government strategy has responded, and levelling up policy being one of the main features. But I'd sort of argue that on the one hand, one of the features is that we've got quite disconnected policy making. So on the one hand, since 2010, you saw national government pursue a policy of austerity, which from a local government perspective meant not just reducing over time the amount of funding that went to local areas, but changing the needs-based funding formula so that where pre-2010 poorer areas got more funding disproportionately based on their higher needs, that got withdrawn. So poorer areas got hit harder by local government funding cuts over the course of 15 years. So on the one hand, you had that kind of structural shift in how funding was allocated locally, But then on the other hand, we saw post-2016 policies like levelling up emerge, which were then a bit to do with kind of passing back bits of funding to local areas and to kind of respond a bit more in the short term to that kind of longer term trend. So we sort of see a bit of a disconnect in terms of the national approach to how we would understand an approach looked after left behind areas. And I think one of the challenges is there tends to be like a huge amount of initiative that is very based on personalities at government. So Boris Johnson was obviously very associated with levelling up. It was very associated with his particular mandate that he had. But we also see particular policies that are responding to kind of the overall approach that we're withdrawing funding from local areas. Some of the manifestations of this are areas that have a sense of decline or have a sense of lack of investment. Some of the most peculiar policies we've seen from the national level have been a national chewing gum task force, whereby, and this is a genuine thing, you can look it up, there was 55 local authority areas were chosen to be given a couple of £1 million each in order to pick up chewing gum stains from the streets. So you sort of have this long-term decline in how we're able to invest in local areas, but then this kind of almost ridiculous like short-term response. My favourite levelling up policy was when Rishi Sunak was in Prime Minister, and he loved chess, and so there was a levelling up chess initiative where there was a sense that northern areas had a disproportionate access to the game of chess, and certain areas were chosen to have park chess tables placed. Not chess pieces, just chess tables, and that was, and this is a genuine kind of policy. So we're long-term kind of withdrawal, and then short-term, this is what they need, and this is the kind of approach. And I think it also speaks to a bit of a kind of paternalistic, benevolent sense, but it's highly short-termist, and it's highly kind of then dependent on the characters that happen to be in Westminster. And so I think the project of devolution, which we might go into in a bit more detail, but the project of devolution has to be more than a sort of a short-term policy initiative. It has to be a deeper governance shift, which I'd argue it isn't yet. It's highly asymmetric. It's quite determined by what different government departments are prepared to cede rather than a much more holistic agenda. I think under this government, the Labour government, there is a real, luckily they're still pro-devolution. There was a sense just before the election, will they carry on with it? Are they still committed? Would this be another policy that would kind of not last a change of government? But it does feel like it's a policy that's here to stay. And so I think that it is a route through which we need to be understanding how we're actually going to shift power in many ways from the centre and that kind of initiative, and not just to what we understand as the sort of sub-region, but down to the local level and down to communities themselves and neighbourhoods themselves. And I think one of the things about left behind areas is we can talk about them in the abstract and conceptualise them as places, but they have people in them. They have people in them who have views about where they would want to, where they find opportunities, views about their experience of what it means to be left behind. And I think a big part of the work that we do at New Local is looking at community-led policy making and practice and how decision-making over public services, over local government, how communities participate in decisions that matter to them. I think that there's a real opportunity not just to think about devolution as a sort of repatriating of this function here, but actually how are we creating a different form of governance. And speaking to your points about the kind of decline in trust in institutions, there's a real kind of failure of institutions to tackle what might be termed the kind of wicked problems, but the kind of complex problems of modern life and entrenched intergenerational inequalities. But I think there's a deep question about how, in practice, the practice of governance at a very local level is sharing power, creating new routes to participation over and above just voting in an election every now and then, and how we're able to really rethink that kind of contact where the local state really has a relationship with people who use their services and people in places. So I think that there is hope. Actually, I think there is an opportunity from the quite centralised starting point of our country here. I'll only talk to the English example, but I think that we've got a real opportunity with devolution to think differently about how institutions work with people.
Thank you very much. Finally, Tom, the view from Essex.
Well, a view from Essex, and there are lots of ways to have a midlife crisis. I chose to move from central government to local government. So I'm going to give you a bit from both perspectives. I'm not an academic, but I have, as Mike said, worked on this for a long time. I mean, your original question to us in advance was about the root causes. So a brief in defence of the Levelling Up White Paper. I mean, the Levelling Up White Paper is good because it defines, I think, those root causes well. It borrows from Diane's capitals. It grounds the analysis in the 6 capitals: physical, human, intangible, financial, social, and institutional. Although I think it's fair to say we ended up following the institutional, i.e. the devolution and governance path, more than many of the others. But not just because I was involved in it. It was a serious piece of work. If you want to know the root causes, the patterns of spatial inequality in England, it's the place to look. And Andy Haldane led that work with Michael Gove, I mean, of course, the author of Brexit, but Michael Gove's sort of political sponsorship. Andy had the Medici model, sort of 16th century Florence. And it's easy to say what doesn't work, but I think the power of that was to say what does work. You know when you're in a successful place because those capitals are strong, because you're mixing economy, culture, the arts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think I would be the first to admit turning that analysis into a program of government is hard. It's really hard. The white paper set out a framework which is long since abandoned. There were 12 missions before Labour adopted 5 missions. There was legislation to put some of that framework into statute, but that's been superseded and overtaken. The underlying point, and I think this is the crucial, what is the timescale of success? Because in local government, I think 6 months or a year ahead, budgets, very day-to-day measures, but I think the levelling up agenda or the regional inequality is many decades. And so my reflection as an observer is that the speed of crisis can never be matched by the speed of response. Industry collapses quickly, but people don't move. And if it's time, like, I'm going to read 2 quotes from work that I've been doing on Essex. And then I think it came through some of the sessions in the morning. I mean, the things that you need to put in place are a combination of transport, so connectivity, skills, investment in innovation in places where it otherwise isn't, public realm, housing, crime, what does it feel like to live around here? These are all the ingredients, but they're the ingredients of short-term remedy, not longer-term structural response. And the other reflection on the Levelling Up White Paper, I think it was trying to do at least 3 things. So it was a sort of traditional, if you like, approach to regional inequality. My very first job in Whitehall was on regional policy, setting up the RDAs. It was definitely a city-centric policy. The engines of growth, particularly in this country, are our cities, or the untapped engines. But then it was trying to get at this deeper issue of what is it like to live around here? Because making London stronger is not going to rescue Harlow, Basildon, Southend, Colchester, Braintree. They are their own places, but you need dignity to live in those places. And that is the core role of local government. So I think, I suppose imperfect thinking is you need long-term thinking for the deep structural inequalities, but you've got to tend to local places with sufficient love, devotion, attention to choke off that feeling of forgottenness. Can I read 2? I'm not an academic, but I've been reading about Essex, so 2 books I highly commend. Gillian Darley's excellent Essex and Ken Walpole's Brightening from the East. And I thought I'd just pick from them because they say a couple of things on these themes. These are sort of slightly long quotes, but then I promise no more. So this is about people moving to Harlow in a chapter called Heaven with the Gates Off. If these residents accepted their new lifestyle with stoicism and humour, others were less positive. The social historian David Kynaston, author of Family Britain, quotes an employee of a firm which was moving out of central London. In 1951, Sandvik Controls offered their Covent Garden-based workers a glimpse of the promised land, a visit to Harlow Newtown, and the smart, purpose-built factory that was to replace their current warren of urban workshops. One was dismissive, viewing it as the sort of thing the planning boys dream up, but which doesn't work out. Social class is all mixed up. Nobody likes that, you know. People like to keep to their own class in practice. Yet 2/3 of Sandvik's workforce opted to go. Despite the continuous prodding of television journalists and sociologists, the Newtown population tended to stay doggedly traditional, crowding their open-plan living spaces with familiar possessions. Echoes of this came from Romania, from communist Romania, where the authorities had bulldozed rural gypsy villages and forced the residents into poorly constructed concrete blocks, only to find them still keeping horses on their balconies, while sheep and goats often reside on Cairo rooftops. And so the killer point here, buildings can rise, landscapes can change in a matter of months, but people adapt more slowly. And that seems to me to get to the heart of levelling up. And if I can just then talk about Ken Walpole. So he's published this book. He writes about London, Essex, its relationships, essays on landscape and memory. Here he's writing about the sort of that familiar quest, new utopias. Many of the changes that the idealists of the earliest 20th century wished to see eventually came to pass. The eradication of insanitary slum housing, an end to long-term unemployment and dependence on charity, or long hours in harsh and dangerous factory conditions. The disappearance of widespread malnutrition, chronic avoidable diseases. Today, most people also enjoy paid holidays, better educational opportunities, and greater leisure time. Yet the communitarians wanted something more. They wanted these things to come about in the name of human fellowship and for the people to participate in the management and making of their own lives in communities of equals through cooperation and mutual assent. And the reason I choose those two is because the deep structural forces of the economy can't possibly, I think, address those more human emotions. And then surely the cure is the role of local government and others to address those very senses of place. So I just sort of throw that into the mix as a counterpoint to the economic analysis.
Thank you. Wow, we've ranged very widely here from the, the global revolt that Andres has described to down to sort of thinking about what's happening in the English context and just this deep analysis of those sort of the different characteristics of policy making in England, which I certainly recognise, down to this very interesting sense of at the human level. In a sense, that's an example of, you know, what does it feel like? How does life work, even though, especially when policy is sort of being done to you, I suppose, in a place. Well, let's cover a couple of those bases. I mean, I suppose to start a little bit with going back to each of your sense of the history of the things that you're interested in. So start with you, Andres. I mean, obviously, you've written a lot about sort of country-level policy, but also the EU, and you touched on it about the sort of cohesion policy as opposed to the sort of more spatially redistributive policies promoted in the EU. I mean, is your sense that there are success stories there? There are things that we can hold on to that have palpably worked, and if so, is there a sort of bifurcation in your mind between the policies you need to sort of help sort of high-income regions move on versus the policies you need in terms of poorer regions? Is that your sense of it?
Okay, yeah, let me start by saying that there's no magic bullet. Yeah. There are a lot of things that can work and a lot of things that don't work. And a lot of things that can work sometimes don't work and vice versa. And I'm just going to start with the whole idea of devolution. Devolution, over the last 3 decades, there has been a devolution revolution across the world. It has been sold as the panacea for economic growth and as a solution for many places, including a lot of places that have been left behind. What has been the problem? That in most places, devolution has not worked. In fact, in most developing countries where it has been implemented, it has been an absolute disaster. The results in most developed countries are mixed, but they tend to go in the opposite direction. So they go in the direction that it doesn't work as well. And the question is devolution per se bad? No. Devolution can actually make a big difference for economic development. But The problem is how devolution has been implemented in many places. It has been implemented in moments of crisis, on a whim, without strong demand bottom-up, and without preparation. And very often we end up with the sort of situations that Jessica was talking about. Devolution is the transfer of powers and resources to elected subnational governments. If then it is the national government that decides that the priority is chewing gum and chess and decides where that should be implemented, where is the devolution? It's another way of doing top-down, centralized policy, and that's bound to fail because it's not empowering the population. It's not actually allowing local elected people to have their own capacity, to develop their own ideas, to choose what is best for their localities, their regions, their areas where they're governing. It doesn't increase the transparency and the accountability, the proximity between those that actually elect the decision makers and the decision makers. And that's one of the main problems why it hasn't worked and why it isn't working and it's not going to work in this country. Because whether you are conservative or Labour, and I agree with Tom, the Levelling Up white paper was actually very nice in the diagnosis. It was an absolute disaster in terms of what it was proposed. And even the meager things that were proposed were the first things to be cut by the government in favor of gimmicks. Now comes Labour and has a white paper on devolution, and it says, we're going to have elected politicians and decision makers, mayors that are going to have complete freedom to do everything they want. And in the next paragraph, they say, provided it's within these priorities, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then, of course, they're going to have no money. And we're going to do like we did before, is a beggar thy neighbor sort of policy. We decide what is important, and then you compete with one another. And you end up favoring the mayor, whether you're Labour or Conservative, it doesn't matter. And it shouldn't happen in this country. But I come from other countries where it happens all the time, and it's sad to see it happen in the UK, that it goes to the mayor that actually belongs most of the time to your party.
Jess, do you recognise that characterisation?
Yeah, I mean, I think devolution in England has been very much a policy rather than a sort of governance shift, and I think it is ceding bits of, it's sort of, I mean, as you characterise it, sort of to the subnational level, ceding bits of funding, so bits of infrastructure, you know, a bit of transport and sort of some housing and planning, and there's so it's sort of the sub-regional layer is kind of conceived as a receiver of bits that central government sort of doesn't want to do anymore or wants to kind of devolve and then maybe cut the funding at the same time because that's kind of quite convenient. And then there are whole swathes of departments that aren't participating in the devolution agenda, health being one of them, although interestingly health has its own sort of devolution agenda to a different footprint, and there's ICBs working in at system levels that are completely misaligned with the democratic boundaries of mayoral combined authorities. So we've got a strange situation where there's a slight direction of travel in the direction of place, notable in certain departmental policies, but they're not aligned around a coherent national agenda for devolution and a national concept of place. So it's all really driven by growth needs and sort of seen to then be unleashing devolution in order to kind of turbocharge national growth, without really thinking about other things that need to kind of come alongside that. So there's a quite a voguish term of inclusive growth that's been kind of in policy circles for numbers of years. Nobody really knows what it means or how you really do inclusive growth, but certainly within the devolution agenda, how you might think about including local populations in the benefits of this potential growth is not quite thought through in terms of the levers that you devolve. So, for example, if you're going to, on the one hand, be turbocharging growth in different sectors, in areas, how are you also thinking about making sure that people, young kids growing up, are developing the skills in order to access that growth? If you've got a sort of 10-year sector strategy, you need a 10-year skills strategy, because in that time, young people will be coming of age and should be taking advantage of those new employment opportunities. At the moment, those levers are misaligned. Interestingly, I think that the devolution agenda we work within now was really informed in the early days by Greater Manchester. They always wanted growth on the one hand and reform on the other hand, because they really saw that the outcomes for the population in Greater Manchester were health was a real barrier to participation in the labour market, for example. So they really saw it as a public service reform agenda at the same time, to really look at what money is spent across their conurbation, and how it could be spent differently, not in silos between different services, but how actually you could really understand at a subnational level what your kind of population needs are, what your population outcomes are, what inequalities mean for that area, where the demand pinch points are, like where there are really deprived neighbourhoods with persistent poor outcomes. And it's at that kind of place level that you can really have a different conversation about your population needs, and then really say, how can we create new models of practice and new ways of working that really target that? And you just can't do that nationally. And I think that there's a where the devolution agenda now is, as you say, it's very focused on mayors as the only democratic innovation, rather than deeper deliberation or participation. So not deep democratic renewal, and just as a growth driver. And I think one of the challenges is people don't necessarily always want growth, because they don't necessarily think it's going to be for me. So how do we make sure growth isn't just a gentrification strategy locally, and how do we make sure it's genuinely inclusive? And I think there's a real opportunity to do that if you really look at what levers you involve in a devolution agenda, but that has to be a whole Whitehall endeavour. And at the moment, it requires no reform at Whitehall, no change in behaviour at Whitehall, and no shift in the silos at Whitehall. And I think that if you were beginning to think not just in terms of vertical devolution of different functions, but actually thinking about kind of creating much more of a place-based policy agenda that was more lateral and collaborative around places, that would make a lot of sense. And I feel that that's the ad hoc direction of travel in different ways, but it's not yet fully kind of part of the devolution agenda.
Okay. I'd be interested in hearing questions whether everyone shares, both of your fairly critical characterisation of the devolution model. Tom, just to come to you, you may want to chip in on devolution, because obviously that's at the heart of the Levelling Up white paper, and pretty much the current government's kept with that model and expanded it. But can I just add another question to you, specifically in terms of your own, I suppose, experience in this area as a policymaker? I mean, it is, if you look back over the last, go back to the RDAs, maybe even before into the major administration, I mean, it's from the mid-90s to now, so in about 30 years, and we've had an extraordinary amount of policy making and churn in terms of the kinds of institutions that central government has tried to create in the English context, as well as, separately in a different way in the UK context, but that's been more stable outside England. But in England, it has been phenomenal when you look at it, all the different kinds of initiatives and the different vehicles that have been created to promote either regional or more city-based, or now this kind of more combined authority mixed sort of mode. Do you think there's been just too much frenetic policy making? Is that your observation, looking at it now?
Yes.
I was hoping for a slightly longer answer.
It's quite hard to subscribe to most of the things that I've worked on for 10 years are a disaster. What is the value of mayors? I think linking some of these questions, these are questions of leadership and stable conditions and the ability to use resources and pool agencies together. There will always be silos in government. Government is simply too big, too complex for there not to be silos. Silos is just another word for specialisms. But the way that you can orient national government around local plans are sufficiently what's the right word? A scale where government can engage sort of 30 or 40 places across the country, not 350. And the big thing that I think mayors allow is unlike RDAs, it's very, very hard to take away democratic office. I mean, people may try, but I think it's unimaginable to remove the London system of mayoral governance. So the mayoralty, the democratic mandate, I think gives you a greater chance of stability. You can't control the electoral cycle, but in the institutions. And so that institutional stability and everything that flows from that is important. And my point about silos isn't to be sort of give up on Whitehall reform, but to put the onus on strategic planning. And then I think you get into very boring, very hard yards of just sustained delivery. So to give you a specific example, I helped set up Homes England. Homes England should work at the behest of mayoral governance, not in, alongside, or independently. But for that to carry weight, as the government is doing, the mayor has to have his or her spatial strategy, and Homes England comes in because as a local area, as a senior local government officer, do I need help on chessboards? Of course I don't. But to construct garden communities in Harlow, Colchester, Chelmsford, that's a partnership. You can never delegate that to a local level. So that you sort of got to invert the things which government is intervening in. It has a huge role to play for the positive. And it should be on those big national endeavours. But the underlying point, Mike, is institutional stability. And I actually think mayors and democracy give you the strongest chance of retaining that.
More than the kind of regional structures that you were involved in?
I think 2010.
Because of the elected element.
Proves that. Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, there's many more questions that I would like to ask, but it's now over to you. You have your chance to have a say. So we'll start in the room. If people can put their hands up. There's a fair few hands going up. So actually what I'm going to do is take these in chunks, I think, because I'm trying to get as many voices in as I can. Can we start over there? Gentleman who looks like Mark Fabian over there. We'll take 3.
Thanks very much. Great panel. Mark Fabian from the University of Warwick and also a fellow here at the Bennett. I wanted to ask a question that I know all of you have really good thoughts on. So the role of place-based community and social infrastructure in kind of taking some of the heat out of this political disenchantment. I know there's quite a lot of research now, some of which you guys have contributed to, on the role that things like community pubs and parades and fetes and fixing the quality of the kind of local streetscape plays in making people feel less disaffected. How do you think we can get that sort of thing going in greater earnestness? And I'm particularly curious maybe why centrist parties that are looking for a narrative against populism and against identitarianism don't embrace more of this kind of community infrastructure. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. So over there, the woman at the back there with glasses, just behind you, just going up, just on your right.
Hi, I'm going to ask a question which I feel a bit like the bad fairy. I'm a Cambridge citizen, and there was a very interesting article in the Financial Times last week by Peter Foster on how Cambridge is going to turbocharge UK growth. I just want to know what does the panel think about the concept of a growth company running a city, because we've got all this discussion going on, and the citizens of Cambridge are not going to get much of a say, it seems, in who makes decisions about the city. It's not clear where the local voice is. Councillors are not going to be involved. This is very much something that's being driven by the university. So I just want to know, I mean, given all this discussion, which is absolutely wonderful and very, very interesting, but do you not see that there is a kind of disconnect between some of what you're saying and what's actually happening, particularly given the situation in Cambridge where we've got, no water, we've got 2 reservoirs coming up, not till 2036, no water pipe transfers till 2032. These are facts.
Yeah. Thank you. You've made your question. Can you have one more? We'll go here. Person here.
Andrew Dames from Cambridge Open Engineering. In England, the phrase postcode lottery is always used with negative connotation. Do you think that needs a reframe, that we should move to celebrating postcode lottery? And if we haven't done that, we haven't given the necessary authority and responsibility to different regions.
Thank you. So 3 questions covering different areas there. So the first one, we'll take them in turn, the sort of community, social infrastructure, local kind of agenda. Who would like to take that, Andre?
Can I link the
go for it.
2 or 3 questions?
I'll do it
Let me start with the question about Cambridge and supercharge the British economy. This is very much coming from the idea that you have places that make a difference, that places that can change, and places that don't matter. And this is what the British government and most European governments have been doing with London. Now it's Oxford and Cambridge, which is more or less the same area, the whole of the southeast. That has 3 assumptions that may or may not be right. The first one is that Cambridge has the capacity to supercharge, to actually keep on growing at the rate it has grown. And Cambridge has grown enormously, and we hope it can do, but it's a bet. It has much stronger cards than if you were to do that in Hartlepool. There's no doubt. But it's not guaranteed. There's no guarantee that that's going to happen. London, where I live and I work, has been doing very well in the last 30 years after 60 years of being in the doldrums, in relative terms. The second assumption, which is where we get into really speculative, is that this is going to trickle down to the rest of the economy. What we're finding in most research now is that it never trickles down. The glass in Cambridge gets bigger, and it doesn't reach anywhere else. And Cambridge sucks resources from the rest of the British economy, which for some might not be bad, for others might be bad. And the third assumption is that if you live in a place where there's no opportunity, you can get on your bike, Norman Teddett's argument, and move to Cambridge. Well, there are a lot of other problems there. But I might not want to get on my bike to go to Cambridge because I'm perfectly happy and I got my life and I think there's potential elsewhere. So those are the 2 problems. One is a bet, a relatively safe bet, but it's still a bet. The others, anyone who can move is moving. What are you going to do in Cambridge if you haven't got the right skills? That's another thing. So that's the question. We need some sort of policies that vary, and that's where I'm going to link it to the question on place-based. We probably need to accept, and this is a postcode lottery, that we have different needs, different conditions, different ecosystems, and different wants in different parts of our countries. And as a result of that, probably decisions need to be made localized. But that implies a different type of devolution than the one we have here. Because I think Tom is absolutely right, saying that having elected mayors gives mayors enormous legitimacy. But those mayors have got limited powers, and they virtually have no budget. Why? Because Westminster doesn't want to transfer powers and doesn't want to transfer resources. And that's a problem, because you cannot have your cake and eat it all at the same time. So if you're going to do devolution, what you need to do is actually transfer powers, transfer resources, sometimes taxation powers, and of course have a fiscal equalization system that is fair to allow places to take their future in their hands, which means going to place-based policies. The way place-based policies is that you respond to the problems and the bottlenecks you have in different places on the basis of the potential that you have. And you create strategies which have significant economic advantages because you actually have a diagnosis which is not a national one, but is adapted to the different potential which is scattered everywhere. And also on top of that, it has significant social advantages because the most important one is you take your own future in your hands. You empower citizens, which is a fundamental change. The problem is, and Tom was talking about people don't adapt. Well, decision makers don't adapt. Why? Because for many reasons, they don't want to give up power. And that's a big problem. And you cannot have it both ways in that respect. Having said that, I'm a bit critical of place-based everywhere, because place-based in many parts of the world, even in the European Union with smart specialization, sometimes has become like a letter to Santa Claus. Everyone wants different things, and they want it. That's why people like Michael Storper, Simone Marino, and myself have been proposing the idea of place-sensitive. Strategies that are based on serious theory, empirical evidence, with goals that are measurable, and that actually, on that basis, then adapt to the local ecosystems. Because one of the things you wanted me to be positive on these things, that there's potential.
Don't tell them that.
I'll tell you this. Everyone is telling us we need to supercharge the places that are the most dynamic. Let's invest in Paris, let's invest in London, in Cambridge, in Madrid, in, in Frankfurt and Munich. But the biggest innovations we've had in Europe in recent years haven't come from the usual suspects. France is the place in Europe investing in AI. Where are we? And not that Paris is doing badly. But no one's talking about the vaccine. And where does the vaccine come from? It comes from the University of Mainz. A good university, but middle ranking in the case of Germany, and by it's a bigger team, two researchers that are immigrants. The biggest success story of the last few years is Novo Nordisk. And it doesn't come from a small place, but it comes from Copenhagen. Again, not Paris, not London. Mm-hmm. And if you push me, I can go to IKEA. Not Stockholm, not Gothenburg, not even Malmö. Amsult. Check it in your Wikipedia. When it started, 2,500 inhabitants, and the biggest furniture company in the world.
Tom, can I come to you? Because in a way, it seems to me the first two questions, those issues were really, both of them were actually at the heart of the Levelling Up White Paper, weren't they? It was about city-based growth, taking bets, as you put it, on certain growth poles, but also it has a lot of this stuff in about social infrastructure, about being more, and indeed about as you were talking about, the sort of thinking about how people feel about that place, and how you do policy around that is obviously tricky. But I'm just curious whether you see those elements in the white paper, and also to postcode lotteries, because of course in a way that's a potential implication of devolution.
Yeah, I mean, I'll sort of pick up a few bits and try to be brief. I mean, it is worth saying the Levelling Up White Paper is now a sort of historic document. You may pull it off the shelf. It's a good document, but it doesn't really determine the direction of policy. I think on the question on growth companies, I mean, I'm not going to walk into a sort of set of unexploded mines in Cambridge. I don't know it well enough. But the underlying thinking on economic growth is it has to be long-term. It has to be quite structural. And you have to remove those sorts of decisions from day-to-day democracy. And that isn't about removal of democracy altogether, but you've got to sort of create decision makers who are capable of taking genuine long-term decisions. And you might argue we have the same problem in Essex. The absence of water and the resistance to development and to infrastructure is sort of part of the problem. It's almost too much democracy, too localised, too resistant. So there's some really interesting questions, but for growth you need strategic vision, long-term planning, long-term funding, stability of direction. And I won't turn this into a local government reorganisation conference. Some of you might be interested, but the government is basically ripping up local government in this country, ending the two-tier system. And I think it probably is a bet that will unlock growth and create more of the sorts of conditions. But of course, that takes you to the other question on, well, if you're lifting decision-making up a level, you've got to have local arrangements for the things that really matter locally, which is why I sort of drew out in my opening remarks those sorts of aspects of community policy. And at the moment, it's all jumbled up. Sort of the same bodies are trying to do long-term economic planning, really serious work, whilst dealing with the day-to-day of sort of neighbourhood. You know, everyone should live in a clean, safe neighbourhood. That's not a controversial statement, but that's not the role of a sort of city region mayor or the mayor of greater Essex. And then on postcode lottery, I mean, we've got to somehow try and end the infantile debate we have in this country. I mean, we have massive disparities, right? Massive disparities within Essex, within east of England, across the south of England, across the whole of England, within, you know. So the idea that somehow we've got these universal entitlements that if we gave a bit more devolution, we'd upend is for the birds. What you need is policies tailored to specific places and to make the very best outcomes. But, I mean, the sort of debate on this is so, not, I don't mean in this room with this audience, but sort of at a national level, it is infantile. You know, the chess is an example, because that's how ministers are responding. Keir Starmer gave a speech about civil service reform, talked about a planning case in a cricket ball, blamed the Sport England for a planning decision because the cricket ball would be hit over the boundary fence. I mean, these are sort of infantile debates. So we've got to change. I mean, I agree, we've got to sort of reverse postcode lottery and be a bit more honest about the disparities that already exist.
Jess?
Yeah, just to follow on from Tom, but the postcode lottery, I think for me is I've sort of Googled it, and I don't think it's part of other political cultures where there's much more decentralisation. I think it is a sort of English-specific fear, and it sort of holds a bit of a shadow over how we think about kind of localised reform. And I think that for me, it's a bit of it just demonstrates that our centralised culture is a culture and a kind of public policy culture as well, because I think that on the real postcode lottery that I see is in terms of outcomes, and we've got a highly centralised country with really kind of a standardised set of public services. So, for example, we have an NHS that is accessible to everyone, free at the point of use, and yet we've got massive health inequalities, such that by postcode, you can expect to vary your life expectancy by about 10 years from place to place, even within the same kind of borough boundary. So there's a sort of postcode lottery fear about the service inputs, but we seem to be relaxed about the reality. The big postcode lotteries of life chances and in terms of outcomes. And I think that how we need to respond to that inequality is by having a much more adaptable approach and a much more place-based approach, such that you're able to say, you know, to experience poverty in Cornwall, for example, is a very different set of challenges and barriers to accessing employment than to be in a London. And we've got to be able to have policy that adapts to those. Just on the kind of community infrastructure point, and this, you know, local government funding and finance is possibly a very techie, boring policy area. And it's really dull to just fund local government properly. But that's what that leads to, you know, just investment in things that matter to people in many ways. And I think that's what's been kind of undermined in many ways. But it's that kind of fabric of community life that really does matter to people. And I mean, the chewing gum task force was maybe onto something in the sense that sometimes there's visible deterioration of things, but actually there's no. I think one of the challenges of policies, we sort of try to kind of recreate other structures like LEPs or other kind of, there's a new kind of plan for neighbourhoods that's creating neighbourhood boards in areas, but actually there's no kind of proxy for just investing in local governance and the spending that you would have in a local area that does matter to people. I think the innovation that does need to happen is much more participation in how that's then allocated.
Thank you. So I've got a few questions coming online. One is a very specific one for Tom, which will help you answer, Tom, is who wrote the books on Essex? They sound fascinating. So I think if we could get the names of the titles and the authors in the chat, we'll answer that question. The other one is a wider one. Local authorities and devolved authorities in England need more capacity and capability if they are going to deliver the development and growth challenges that we've been talking about. What does the panel think needs to happen to ramp up the capacity and capability at those levels? And it sort of follows a bit on what you've just been saying, Jess. Do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I think that's important, and I think there's another question as well about the capacity within the new strategic authorities that are being created, because one of the kind of promises of the English Devolution White Paper is, for the first time, it does set out an intention to cover the map in terms of, in England, national, sub-regional, local authorities, and it does give a kind of role for local authorities around public service reform and kind of recognises them, which is an important step. I think there's a real need, though, to understand and clarify what the kind of skill sets and capacity and workforce needs to look like at the strategic level, and then what needs to happen at the local level. And I would argue that it's at that local level that you do the delivery, and it's at the strategic level that you are strategic. And I think there can be a bit of a confusion that there's a sense that it's delivery that happens at the strategic level, or if we're just thinking about that strategic authority as being either civil servants working at that level or local government officers working at that level, we're actually kind of missing an opportunity to really define what that governance looks like. So I actually think it also reflects what the relationship, that kind of collaborative governance, the strategic authorities are collaborations of the local authorities, but operating at that level. So at that level, you can do data insights into population needs. You can really kind of, at that kind of critical mass, you can have some real specialist expertise that can then support the role of local authorities in much more neighbourhood level working. I think one of the things that we've seen over recent years in local government is sort of an understanding that there can be a real diseconomy of scale, even at the borough level. I think in the early days of austerity, there was a sense that you would kind of commission out services and kind of drive down unit costs, and bigger scale was better. But actually, there's such a sense that even within borough boundaries, experiences in different neighbourhoods are so starkly polarised that you actually need to think at that local authority level, how are you working in a much more distributed way, so that in some neighbourhoods you're working in a much more kind of investment focused way, a much more kind of community development with areas that might need that or require that kind of community based capacity. In other areas you don't need to operate on that footing. So I think there's a real need to understand how in a kind of local authority way you're working in those much more distributed ways, even within the same organisation.
Yeah, and Andres, does this go to the unfunded mandates?
Well, I'm going to talk about first the capacity and then unfunded mandates. There's a funny sort of situation here. I've been doing quite a lot of work on the impact of devolution across the world on economic development, looking fundamentally at two factors, economic growth and economic inequality. And we always worked under the assumption that devolution was going to lead to greater growth, and it was going to increase inequalities because you have different capacities in different parts of a country, and therefore it's not the same having a local government in London or having a local government in another part of the country. What we found is this works, well, in most developing countries it doesn't work at all. So lower growth and higher inequalities. You have, if you are like Indonesia and you do big bang devolution overnight, you find that suddenly in Papua or in Eastern Kalimantan, the local authorities are ill-prepared to actually deliver on anything. What we found in the developed world, including the UK, was that it didn't lead to greater growth, but it reduced inequalities. And we were surprised at the beginning. And then when you start digging into the analysis, why? Because capacity is not the main problem. A job in the public administration in Teesside is a very good job. And it attracts significant talent that is already there. And talent that is going to be stable and is going to remain there. The problem we have in universities in the UK, in London, for example, and I have wonderful administrators, but is that those that are really good very often don't remain. And if they remain, it's because they are vocational, because they can get better rewards somewhere else. So we have to go in a constant cycle of hiring and training and retraining, meaning that there's much lower continuity and, amazingly, possibly lower capacity. So there's a need for training, there's a need for improvement, there's a need, you're going into new functions, there's a need for improvement of capacity, but capacity is not your main problem. And in a country like the UK, and in most developed countries, there's plenty of capacity in these areas. Not all talent is concentrated in London.
I think the question is particularly getting at, I think, specific kinds of capacity around like data analysis or those kind of, as you would...
Those capacities are also available in other places.
Yeah,
and the main problem is one of unfunded mandates.
Yeah. Did you, when you the white paper, did you think about this at all? This question, because obviously it's a very strong pro-devolution message.
Not sort of deeply on capacity. I mean, government white papers tend to have sort of on page 78, and there should be a secondment and interchange scheme. There were some sort of fairly trite answers. I mean, the thing, sort of working in Essex County Council is dominated by adult social care and children's social care and the pressures on budgets. So the capacity is partly a funding one, and I don't want that to sound like a begging bowl, but the sort of statutory services squeeze out some of the very things that we're talking about here today, which are more discretionary in legal terms. I mean, I was very struck. Essex has not adopted the 4-day week and is extremely unlikely to do so. But the thing in the earlier session about how that had changed the number of applicants. So if we're thinking about, for jobs, if we're thinking about how does the public sector make itself attractive, I think there are freedoms and flexibilities which are slightly different. And then a couple of other, I mean, the projects I always look towards, London Challenge, which turned around London education, a very particular programme, very, very dynamic leadership, given freedoms. It wasn't anything to do with devolution, but the conditions of leadership and freedom were very important, and teach first. And when, to recruit highly skilled graduates into teaching, when I went to Homes England, so it was 2017, there are a very significant number of staff at Homes England whose graduate trainee programme was in English partnerships 20 years previously, and that is the sort of thing we're not investing in. And I think there must be a programme. I mean, the government talks about sort of 300 new planners. That doesn't touch this. Like serious programmes that will yield results in 10 years' time of people who are trained, schooled in public service, who are committed to it. So there is a vocation, who enjoy the freedoms of the sort of working flexibilities we have. And then, I mean, we probably sound a bit jaded on this platform, like there are no levers. It is brilliant work to work on these complex, wicked issues that we talked about with public backing, with elected politicians, because I could point to hundreds of lives. We may not have changed the structural shape of Essex in work that our politicians have led on levelling up. We've changed hundreds of lives through it. So it's important to remember that there is very significant positive work going on every day of the week, even if our structural challenges are sort of on another level of magnitude significant. So kind of come and work for Essex County Council.
I didn't realise you were coming here to recruit.
Cheaper housing as well.
I think we've got time for one more question. So I can see, I think the woman there in the middle, if you just...
Thank you. My name's Alice Taylor. I work at the Economic and Social Research Council, and I lead the UKRI Local Policy Innovation Partnerships, which is a £23 million programme to pilot 4 partnerships. Interestingly, 3 of them are in the devolved nations, and I haven't heard much from the panel about the devolved nations. It doesn't strike me as particularly... it wasn't unexpected that successful applicants came forward from those nations, because they are, I would argue, better networked, and those relationships are closer, and they have greater powers in terms of the policy makers' leverage over particular public services and addressing particular challenges. So I'd just be really interested in what we can learn in terms of place-based work that addresses challenges from the devolved nations of the UK.
Anyone want to pick that up? So it's quite a particular question, Jess.
Yeah, I mean, so England's got loads to learn from Wales and Scotland, and it's actually one of the challenges. We're quite insular in England, I think, and there's not necessarily a sense of learning, but in Wales there's the Future Generations Wellbeing Act, which has really kind of created a long-termism, or embedded a sort of sense of long-termism in policy. I think there's a lot to learn from, particularly when we're so sort of short-term and kind of increasingly reactive. And then in Scotland, the public policy landscape is much more, the local government landscape is much more enabled around public service infrastructure, and there's lots more, there's a kind of community empowerment act, just as we were doing the Localism Act, which arguably didn't do very much and kind of came at the same time as there was a project of of local government funding cuts. In Scotland there was the Empowerment of Communities Act that was really involving how you would look at public services across the local authority footprint, but in the round, and that kind of to this day shapes public service reform. And I think one of the things is the scale of those two nations, I think, creates much more of a kind of system-based working. So that means that there's much more kind of collaborative work within the local authority kind of family and the devolved assemblies. And I think that, for me, is a bit of a model for what we'd like to see with sub-regional governance here, kind of creating that wider system, but then in a much more distributed model. So I think there's lots to learn, and we don't always look close to home when we do international comparisons.
Thank you. No, my only cautionary note would be, if you talk to people in local government in Scotland, they talk about the Scottish government in a very similar way to the way people in English local government do, but I think that is a good point. Okay, we've come to the final moment of this session. Andres has given away my what I was talking to the panellists about beforehand. I wanted to send you out on a notes of positivity. So don't worry. And we've had some good positive comments, which is good, because this can be a somewhat depressing subject, or particularly if we think around the structural challenges, which we've all talked about. But I just wanted to ask each of you, and you've got less than a minute to answer this, to just give us something that you, a particular policy approach, or indeed a specific policy, probably not chewing gum, no, probably not the task force, but something that you've come across in your work or your study, which you think is something we should really be thinking about doing here in the UK right now. What would be the one thing, if you had Keir Starmer's ear, let's say, that you'd want to tell him about? Who wants to go first?
I'm a real geek about this total place funding, which is, and you knew I was going to say that. Yep. The end of the Labour government pre-2010, there was a kind of policy that it didn't have time to kind of bear fruit. It was essentially look at every place, local authority level, understand what funding goes into it through all the different public service agencies, the non-departmental government bodies, and understand how funding flows in a place, what money is currently being spent, also in terms of like welfare costs, what is the total spend in an area. Once you understand that, you could say, well, how could we spend it differently? And how could you convene all those different agencies in a place to understand deeply what the kind of population needs are, what community aspirations are, and really change ways of working that are much more integrated. And I think that one of the features of the initiativitis of our system is it's been lots of different little place-based pilots here and there, and that's been over the course of like 20 years. And actually we sort of know enough to take a punt on, with a really dire fiscal climate, can't necessarily spend more money, but you could spend money better if you sort of devolved it and really gave partners autonomy in places.
Thank you. And there was a paper that, a great paper on this that Jess has co-written with John Denham, I think, came out last year, which people are interested in that, they might want to look up. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, things I've already said. The London Challenge, I think, is a sort of case study at enough scale, so turning around education provision in the late 1990s in London. I mean, a lot of our levelling up thinking was, some of the best conversations I had were on that. I do think sort of looking at Greater Manchester and its 30 or 40 year journey is just really, really important, and Howard Bernstein's leadership as an official, as an officer, alongside the political leadership, but great lessons in stability. And then I live in East London, so the sort of Olympics and the scale of change in East London, building on London's wider growth, I think trying to pull the lessons. So 3 for 1, I'm afraid.
Very good. I only wanted 1, but I got 3. Andres?
Okay, I'm going to give you principles which are based on the cases that are successful. Estonia, Baden-Württemberg, the Basque Country, for example. What are the principles that I think should be applied? The first one, there should be a belief in the potential of places. Very often we have the impression that that many decision makers don't believe that there's potential everywhere. And in the case of the UK, very often that belief seems to permeate to some of the cradles of the Industrial Revolution, some very large cities and regions, which have not lost their mojo overnight. Second, you have to devolve, but if you're going to devolve, do it in an integrated and balanced way. So you need legitimacy, but you also need powers and you need resources. And that means you need trust in local authorities. Third, empower the stakeholders, the population, the people there. Allow them to take the future in their own hands. And then finally, convince decision makers, in this case in Westminster, but in many countries across the world, that there's life beyond making decisions at the central level, and they can be done locally. And that would be beneficial for the country, and they could also be beneficial for themselves because they have many more jobs that will serve as a trampoline to actually go into higher up the scale. If you put all those four principles together, I mean, it's not guaranteed that you're going to achieve success everywhere, and there will be problems, and it's difficult, and development is a messy issue. But the chances that you are far more successful than what we have been so far, in which we have a lot of cases of intervention, very few successes, a lot of failures. We can turn many of those failures into significant successes.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you, the other panelists as well, for a really interesting discussion, which ended on these very positive notes, I'm pleased to say. Just to the audience, I think we'd like everyone to sort of leave the room now. We're just going to turn it around in preparation for the keynote, which begins in, I think, 10, 15 minutes. And just it remains for me to ask you to thank the panelists.